You are listening to Lighthearted, the official podcast of the United States Lighthouse Society. My name is Jeremy D'Entremont. Welcome. Today is January 28th, 2024, and this is episode 262 of Lighthearted. My co-host today is the outreach manager for the Point Cabrillo Lightkeepers Association in California, Jen Lewis. Hey, Jen.
Hey, Jeremy. Happy to be back. Thanks for having me on.
It is so great to have you back, Jen. You've co-hosted before. You've been a guest. It's always a pleasure, and thank you so much for doing this.
Of course. I love your podcast. I love everything you guys do for the U.S. Lighthouse Society. I'm very happy to be here.
Well, always good to have you on board. In a few minutes, we're going to listen to an interview about Old Point Loma Lighthouse in San Diego, down at the other end of California from where you are, Jen. We've had some crazy weather here in the Northeast lately. More than a dozen lighthouses were damaged in storms last week. Jen, you had some wave damage at Point Cabrillo last year, right? I'm wondering if you've had anything even remotely like that since then.
You know, we've definitely had a couple scares this year. We just passed the 1-year anniversary of when the waves crashed through the back doors at Point Cabrillo on January 5th. And so around that same week, we were having the king tides. We had some really big swells. So we did go ahead and do some cautionary actions. We put some plywood up on the back doors and windows. And of course, nothing came up over the cliff except for spray over here on the Northern California coast. So we got out pretty lucky this winter so far.
Well, that's good news. And you're all recovered from what happened last year, are you?
We sure are. Yeah, we're still working on a couple things. We're redoing our museum. We're getting some new exhibits in there, but for the most part, we're back to our regular operations, which is so nice.
Yeah, you're open all year, right? Do you get a lot of visitors in the winter?
It definitely quiets down quite a bit this time of year, but we are open every day of the year. It's on days when the wind is blowing that rain sideways. We don't get a lot of folks making the half-mile walk down to the lighthouse, but it's really fun on those holiday weekends in January and February to see the folks come in. We've had some nice sunny days. We have had some very brutal rainy days, but it's nice to have that balance sometimes.
Well, lighthouse being open all year is kind of a foreign idea to me here in New England. You wouldn't want to have a lighthouse open in this. Right now, it's about 20 degrees outside, so not too many people would come. Yeah, especially on the water, of course. It's especially cold. But anyway, as I said earlier, our topic today is Old Point Loma Lighthouse in San Diego. We're not trying to confuse listeners, but they might get a little confused by this because Old Point Loma is in a park in San Diego known as the Cabrillo National Monument, and that is not to be confused with your lighthouse in Northern California, Point Cabrillo. Can you explain a little bit about that? And I'll bet you get asked about that all the time.
Absolutely. I will often get calls for folks thinking that they're about to visit a San Diego lighthouse and asking for directions to our Mendocino lighthouse. We are named for the same fellow. Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo was an explorer who sailed under the Spanish flag in the early 1500s. And he was the first European explorer to set foot in California. And so there are just so many places in California named after him. So we've got a lot of Cabrillos all over our state.
Sure. I just want to make sure listeners can discern between Point Cabrillo Lighthouse and the Cabrillo National Monument down south. Have you ever been to the Old Point Loma Lighthouse?
I sure have. That place is so beautiful. I have family down in San Diego. My grandparents and my cousins, my aunt and uncle live down there, and got the chance to head out to the Old Point Loma Lighthouse a couple years ago, which was such an incredible adventure. It's so gorgeous out on that point. I actually rented a bike and biked all the way out there. And boy, that was a trek. That was not maybe not my best decision. That was very, very good workout, but beautiful place to visit and just gorgeous views no matter where you are on that point.
Oh, yeah. And of course, the lighthouse is like 400 feet above the water. And you can, on a clear day, you can see all the way to Mexico. So it's pretty incredible. Yeah, I visited San Diego and the Cabrillo National Monument, Old Point Loma Lighthouse back in 2015. I was working on a book on West Coast lighthouses at the time. I actually flew to San Diego and rented a car and drove from San Diego to Seattle. That was quite an adventure by myself. Never forget that. But I love visiting Old Point Loma Lighthouse. And I also, the same day or the next day, whatever it was, I took a tour of Old Town San Diego, which was also really, really interesting and fun. I love Balboa Park, the garden there, and the zoo, of course, very famous. So there's a lot to see around there. I love San Diego. So moving on, let's go ahead and introduce today's guests. Please help me out, Jen.
Sure thing. Congress authorized lighthouses at several California locations in 1850, including San Diego. The city was developing into a popular stopping point for people bound for the gold rush to the north.
Construction began in 1854 on a lighthouse on a high bluff at the end of Point Loma, more than 400 feet above the sea. The style chosen was a so-called Cape Cod-style building, consisting of a keeper's dwelling with a cylindrical lighthouse tower in the center.
The lighthouse at Point Loma began service in November of 1855 with a third order Fresnel lens. The active life of the lighthouse was fairly short, as it turned out. The great height of the light station gave the light brilliant visibility in clear weather, but it was a handicap when low clouds and fog surrounded the bluff. For that reason, a new lighthouse was built on the low tip of the peninsula.
Darkened for good on March 23, 1891, the original lighthouse ultimately became known as the Old Point Loma Lighthouse. Old Point Loma Lighthouse, as we were talking about, is now a popular attraction within the National Park Service's Cabrillo National Monument.
A reconstructed assistant keeper's house built on the site of the original and using the original plans features lighthouse-related exhibits including 2 Fresnel lighthouse lenses, a third order that served in the active Lower Point Loma Lighthouse, and also a fixed 5th order lens from San Diego's old Ballast Point Light Station.
We have 3 guests today. Amanda Gossard is program manager for the Cabrillo National Monument, and Karen Scanlon and Kim Fahlen are longtime volunteers for the Cabrillo National Monument. They're also the co-authors of the book, Lighthouses of San Diego. Kim and Karen also happen to be identical twin sisters. It was a pleasure to speak with Karen, Kim, and Amanda just a couple of days ago, so let's listen to that conversation now. I'm speaking this afternoon with 3 guests. We have Amanda Gossard, who is the program manager for the Cabrillo National Monument, and Karen Scanlon and Kim Fahlen, who are longtime volunteers for the Cabrillo National Monument and the Old Point Loma Lighthouse, which is our main subject for today. Karen and Kim are also the co-authors of the book Lighthouses of San Diego. So thank you so much, Karen, Kim, and Amanda, for joining me today.
Thank you for having us on.
Amanda, we'll start with you. I understand you've worked for the National Park Service for more than 15 years, if I have that right.
Yeah, I've actually worked at Cabrillo National Monument for my entire career, all 15 years. And I did do a 4-month detail at Sequoia and Kings Canyon. So that was really nice career development. But aside from that, all 15 years in San Diego.
You must like it there.
I do, yeah. Both my parents were park rangers, and so I grew up in a lot of different national parks. Yeah, I spent some time in Glen Canyon, Death Valley, Petrified Forest. It's a real idyllic childhood.
Wow. So Karen and Kim, where are you from originally, and what brought you to San Diego?
Hi, I'm Karen of the twins.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but thank you for saying who you are, Karen. That might be a good idea as we go on here.
All right. Well, we grew up in a small town in eastern Ohio, and I moved to San Diego in 1973, a new bride to a young Navy ensign just out of medical school. The Navy never moved us from San Diego in Tom's 29 years of Navy medicine. And Kim and her husband moved to San Diego 3 years later. He loved ocean fishing, and hooray, Kim and I would be together again. Those 3 years was the only time we've spent apart in all of our lives. Separate houses, of course.
Part 2 is, how did you become Lighthouse volunteers?
When my kids had the nerve to grow up and go on to college, in 2000, I wrote a letter to the superintendent asking if they used volunteers up here, and it happens that they did. So I took over from a man who had cleaned the lighthouse lens and the lantern itself, the glazing and all, for a lot of years, and he trained me, and from then on, that's been my job up here.
Mm-hmm. And this is Karen again, and Kim was up here first, as she just said, and her affection of lighthouse optics began when we were children, and our family camped under the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. Well, at the time, the lighthouse bug bit her, and the mosquitoes bit me. That's what we remember.
Oh, that's great. Well, yeah, Cape Hatteras is certainly a place you could be inspired by.
Oh, boy, indeed. Yes.
Yeah.
Kim began cleaning the lens and the lantern 23 years ago, and I joined her 10 years later after spending a career of volunteer time at the Maritime Museum in San Diego. Shipwrecks were my thing. Turns out ships need lighthouses.
Oh, yeah, no doubt about that. So that what you just said about cleaning the lens kind of brings me to my next question, and either or both of you can take it. But what are some of the obviously that's one of the things you do as volunteers, but can you elaborate on that? What are some of the other things you do as volunteers?
My volunteer service, this is Kim, only has been with the lantern and the light and the lens. Not only, but it's quite a job up there to get the windows clean and the lens and the ditches in the lighthouse and all the various aspects in the lighthouse. So it's quite a job, but it is the only one that I've ever done. I used to do it myself, and then Karen started helping. So. Mm-hmm.
It's quite a rare privilege to clean a Fresnel lens like that, isn't it? I've actually cleaned a fourth order lens a number of times here at Portsmouth Harbor Light, near where I live, and I just it's really special. You feel like you're cleaning a part of history for sure.
Well, now you really have said it, because I've gotten to clean the lens, the big first order lens at North Ronaldsay Lighthouse, the islands north of Scotland, all the way, well, not all the way to, but also on the Isle of Wight in southern England. So I'm pretty smug about that.
Wow. Oh, that is fantastic. Yeah, I was going to ask you about that maybe before we're done. I know I've read that you saw lighthouses in Scotland and loved it, and I did too. So let's put that on hold for the moment, but it's pretty amazing over there. Some great lighthouses, some great lenses. So I read an article about the two of you, Karen and Kim, and one of the articles said that you volunteer at two lighthouses in San Diego, and I'm trying to figure out what are they talking about? What are they talking about besides Old Point Loma?
Oh, yes. Kim and I have had a good run with the lower or operational Point Loma Lighthouse. When the Old Point Loma went out of service in 1891, it took two lighthouses to do the job. So they put a lighthouse lower to the sea and one on at the harbor. But we've had the good fortune of documenting much of the history of the Point Loma or operational light through a fluke of circumstances. And we've had the privilege there few others have had as writers, and Kim also as a photographer. And we gave the lens its last cleaning in the tower with a picnic on the lantern, a set of melancholy twins removing a lantern from its seat in the tower. But we're happy that it has a new home at Cabrillo National Monument, and we gave it its first cleaning there too in 2005.
So let's, Amanda, let's get back to you here. What are some of the things you do in your position as a program manager at Cabrillo National Monument?
Yeah, specifically, I'm the program manager for the Interpretation, Education, and Volunteers Division. And essentially, our division is responsible for telling the many stories of this place, from the natural to the historical and everything in between. We also work with volunteers who help us tell those stories. And honestly, we just would not be as effective at what we do without volunteers like Kim and Karen.
And speaking of Cabrillo National Monument, could you answer a question for me, really a two-part question. Why is it called a monument instead of a national park? And who is Cabrillo? Who is it named for?
Great questions. Yeah, the difference between a national monument and a national park is essentially in how they are established. So a national monument is established by presidential proclamation, and a national park takes an act of Congress to establish. They're both, regardless of how they were established, administered by the National Park Service.
And tell me about Cabrillo. Why is it named for him?
Yep, our park was established by President Woodrow Wilson in 1913, and that was to commemorate the landing of Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo, who was the first European to step foot on what is now the west coast of the United States. Initially, the park was less than an acre, which surrounded the Old Point Loma Light in an effort to preserve it as well.
And up in Northern California, you have Point Cabrillo Lighthouse. I'm sure people probably get a little confused about that. So.
Yes. We were just talking about that before we joined you, that people do get those two lighthouses quite confused often.
Yeah, you would think that Point Cabrillo Lighthouse might be in the Cabrillo National Monument. So this is, I think, for Kim or Karen or both, but I'm just wondering, why was a lighthouse built at Point Loma in the first place? And just remind me when it was built.
Well, in 1851, the U.S. Coast Survey for the federal government determined the sites for the West Coast lighthouses. Obviously, or it seems obviously, with Point Loma and San Diego being the most southwestern point, and because the peninsula juts out as it does, it seemed like a very perfect spot to build the lighthouse.
Did it have anything to do with the gold rush going on at that time, or why was there maritime traffic around there at that time?
Yes, it did have. The first 8 lighthouses were established. When that gold rush started, there was no light. Harbors were putting as many lights out as they could, so the government built the first 8 lighthouses. Mm-hmm. And San Diego, of course, was one of those first 8.
And the lighthouse, of course, where it was built and where it still stands today, is approximately 400 feet above sea level, which is extremely high for a lighthouse. As we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment, but I imagine that its location was pretty isolated in the mid 19th century when it was first built. So let's talk a little bit about the building of it. Was the construction itself quite difficult?
Well, that the lighthouse was not exactly in San Diego when the Gibbons and Kelly, the contractor, arrived here. They realized it was out at this high peninsula, and they had no access to the site, and so a road had to be built from the dock up to the site, and that became quite a point of contention with the federal government, because it cost them $15,000 to build the road to get supplies to the site, and even the initial contract was $15,000. So it really was a problem.
And the administration too was kind of disorganized. So building these lighthouses was pretty tricky business at the time.
So the Old Point Loma Lighthouse, as we now know it, was active as an aid to navigation for only a little over 35 years, not a really long time. Why did it need to be replaced in 1891?
Because of, and the topographer said in 1890, whatever it was, 1850, excuse me, said don't put a lighthouse on the top of that 462-foot cliff because you're going to have trouble with fog and low cloud, which they did. So that's why they needed to replace it, because San Diego wanted to become a prominent shipping harbor, but they couldn't get a reasonable lighthouse to work in good weather and bad weather, and they needed to dredge the harbor. So that was San Diego's downfall until we put 2 new lighthouses down, and that was the operational lighthouse, which still operates today, and that's the 1891 Point Loma Light Station.
One thing I was curious about, you just said the 462-foot high cliff or bluff or whatever we refer to it as, but peninsula, that's a better word. Yeah. Peninsula. And I think I've read, about 400 feet, but actually 462 feet, that's more than I realized. And that would have to make it one of the high, even though it's not active anymore, has to be one of the highest lighthouses above the water in the country. Is that right?
It was at the time. Yes, it was the highest lighthouse in the country. It became that the height of the lighthouse added about the 60 feet. It was about 400 feet, but with the focal plane was at 460.
Oh, okay. Yeah, but still, that's amazingly high. So I'm not surprised it was kind of lost in the clouds and had to be replaced. So I'm wondering about human stories about the history of the light station. As we were saying, it had to be pretty isolated in the early days. But just in general, are there any stories of keepers and families at Point Loma Light Station? And by that, I'm including both the old light and the one that replaced it. Any interesting human stories about these places?
It's interesting to think of Captain Israel, the last lighthouse keeper. He was here for 19 years, which is really quite unusual because there had been a lot of turnover. But to think of him shooting his shotgun to advise of fog and guiding the ships that were waiting to come into the channel. Another thing, Ross Holland, whose name you know for having written so many books, he said one time about what a sweet picture it made to think of Maria Israel, who was Captain Israel's wife, but she was assistant keeper for several years. But to think of her sitting and reading or knitting or doing her sewing work in the light of the lantern, sitting at the bottom of the stairs, I've often thought that painted a sweet picture.
And then there were a lot of good stories during World War II at the start and even at the end. There's so many great stories. And the two teen daughters of the two keepers at the lower lighthouse were out riding horses along the dirt road above the sea. And they had come upon a scene that hadn't been there. Lexi said it looked like a rocket ship standing in an oil derrick. There were men in suits busy at the base, and they were pretty excited about this. And the girls thought they were making a movie. So they rode home to tell their fathers, and Lexi Johnson, her father was keeper out there, put his finger to her nose and scolded, "You didn't see it, and I don't want to hear another word about it." And turns out it was a rocket standing in an oil derrick, and it was Convair's test site for the rocket motor of the first Atlas missile.
Wow.
And then they moved that to White Sands, New Mexico, ultimately, but they weren't shooting the rocket from Point Loma, they were testing the rocket motor. And eventually there were two big silos out here for that Convair test site.
Okay. As you were telling the story, I was starting to wonder if it was some sort of UFO or something. And maybe, I guess it sort of was in a way.
No. Yes, it must have looked that way to the keeper's daughters.
I'm glad you mentioned F. Ross Holland a few minutes ago because he was an important lighthouse historian. I was lucky enough to meet him in 1989 and record a speech that he gave at that time. So
yes, I met him here at Cabrillo National Monument one time too. He had actually been a ranger here at Cabrillo National Monument, and so it was he who wrote most of the history that we know of Old Point Loma.
Wow. Well, that's important to know. I'm glad that came up. Back to the life of keepers there. I think I've read that the keepers actually didn't have a boat at that station? And if so, how did they travel to and from town to get supplies?
Mostly by horse and buggy. That was a lot, especially at the upper Point Loma too, of course. But at one time, Keeper Israel had a small rowboat and his son lost it. Now, we're not sure what happened there, whether it sunk or what, but the lighthouse board docked Dad's pay $25 a month until the boat was paid for. And Israel was furious about this and caused some trouble. He moved down to the lower lighthouse shortly after this incident, and he caused some trouble down there with the cement. That's another whole story we don't have time for. But he lasted at the lower lighthouse for less than a year before he was let go. Interesting. There was that boat we knew about, but otherwise, boats from town, I know that when they were testing or measuring for the lens at the lower Point Loma Light, they came out in boats, and often they got stuck in tides, and that was troublesome. Otherwise, they came out in horse and buggy.
Eventually, I wonder if lighthouse tenders came there with supplies. Do you know about that?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. Yeah. But they had to stand offshore and bring them in with small boats.
Right. Okay.
There was no dock out here.
It's my understanding that the old lighthouse was pretty much abandoned for a while and wasn't in such great shape for quite a while. Was it actually in danger of being demolished?
Yes, actually, and it came close to being so. There was a group of, I think, of Portuguese who wanted the lighthouse torn down so they could put a big monument to Cabrillo up here. And even it is noted in the history with a latrine in it, which is fairly weird. But yes, it came very close. And then Cabrillo National Monument holds an interview from Celia Sweet, who was married to the lighthouse keeper at Ballast Point Light Station. Late in her life, she said how sad it was that people came up here that she watched and just that they stole every part of the lighthouse, and it just seemed to break her heart the way it reads.
Anybody can take this question, including Amanda. But how did the Old Point Loma Lighthouse come under the management of the National Park Service?
When Cabrillo National Monument was established in 1913, it actually predated the establishment of the National Park Service, which wasn't created until 1916. So even though we had preserved this structure, there was really no central agency to really maintain it. So the government kept a hold of it, or sorry, the military kept a hold of it for quite some time through World War I, through World War II, and then in between there, around 1933, it was a concessionaire for a while. So there was a small gift shop in there, and then the World War II occurred, so they had to close that concession down. And then after that, the National Park Service took it back.
You know, as you're speaking, I just was remembering something. I have a large collection of antique lighthouse postcards, and I'm sure all of you have seen that there's a number of early postcards, like early 1900s postcards of Old Point Loma, that actually call it Old Spanish Lighthouse, as if like people thought that it was built by the Spanish in the early days of the Spanish in California. Is that something you've seen as well?
Yes.
There was a man, I forget his name now, I could look it up, but he looked after the lighthouse up here for a while, and it was he who began calling it the Spanish Lighthouse. It was pretty early in time, but it seems to be that he was the one who started that, but it definitely was built by the U.S. government.
Sure, yeah. So let's jump ahead to the present day, and I'm wondering if people visit there, which I did back in 2015, really enjoyed my visit there. What is there to see besides the lighthouse? And Amanda, you might want to take this first. Is there a visitor center there?
There is a visitor center, yes, which is also part of a Mission 66 historic district. So it's historic itself.
And there's a reconstructed or rehabilitated, is that the proper word to use? But it's a replica of the assistant keeper's house, and there's exhibits in there as well, right?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, that was going back to your last question about if the lighthouse was ever, at risk of being demolished. The assistant keeper's quarters was completely demolished and removed from the property. And it wasn't until, I believe, 2004 that we began a project to rebuild the assistant keeper's quarters. Oh, maybe a little bit earlier. But it's great, and it acts as a museum. So while the lighthouse itself isn't necessarily accessible to all people, the assistant keeper's quarters is, and so people can go in there and learn about what it was like to be a lighthouse keeper in the 19th century, get a feel for life and how isolating it was.
But there also are some really great displays in there. There are 2 lighthouse lenses, which is very exciting. There's the 3rd order 12-panel flashing lens that served the Point Loma light station down below, and also the 5th order fixed lens that was in the former Ballast Point light station. And there's also actually a clockwork to a lens that was, this gets confusing. There was a lens slated to come to San Diego that never did come here and was used at Chicago Harbor. But we've got on display there the clockwork for that rotating lens.
And we have that lens in our accession building up here at Cabrillo.
Interesting.
To answer the rest of your question, aside from all the fascinating exhibits that we have about our lighthouse, we have an exhibit dedicated to telling the history of Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo. There's hiking trails, amazing views. You could see out into the Pacific Ocean. You could see all the way into Mexico, the San Diego city skyline. It's gorgeous.
Base End Station.
Yep, the Base End Station is a bunker from World War II that has been completely
decked out.
Yeah,
Decked out in World War II.
Yeah, you go in it and you're immediately transported back into time, and you can get a feel for what it might have felt like out here during that time of war. There's a lot of other military assets scattered throughout the park. And during the winter, it's not only the Pacific gray whale migratory season, you can see them passing by, but we also have amazing tide pools in our coastal area.
Yeah, I was there on a beautiful, clear spring day in 2015, in April of 2015. I remember the fantastic view from there for sure. So a moment ago, we were talking about the 2 Fresnel lenses you have on display in the assistant keeper's house, but I believe there's also a Fresnel lens in the lantern room of the Old Point Loma Lighthouse. Is that right?
Yes, there is, and that's the one Kim and I get to clean. But yes, that lens came from the Mile Rocks Lighthouse at San Francisco Bay. They changed the shipping route along where that lighthouse passage, where it's the passage out there, and they changed that route and didn't need that lighthouse anymore, so the lens became available.
Yeah, and I think they actually kind of chopped off most of the lighthouse, so it's just a base left out there.
Yeah, there are pictures of it.
Yeah, I've seen old postcards and things of it, but it's not much to look at today. So here's a question for you, Amanda. In addition to just people can come and when the park and lighthouse are open and go in the lighthouse and the assistant keeper's house and everything, are there also special programs and talks in the park?
There are, yeah. In fact, 3 days out of the year, visitors can go into the lantern room and walk out onto the gallery of the lighthouse. Typically, it's closed to visitors just to maintain safety and the structural integrity of it. And then we open it up those 3 days out of the year. If visitors are interested in going to one of these open tower days, the information is available on our website.
Which is, it's part of the National Park Service website, of course.
Yes, yeah, nps.gov/CABR.
CABR, excellent. Thank you. I'm glad you mentioned that. So we're actually recording on, let's see, what's today's January 16th. People will be hearing this a little bit later. But from what I've been reading, there's actually some rehabilitation work happening there at the lighthouse. Has that actually started yet?
It has, yeah. In fact, it just started today. Yeah. And the lighthouse will be closed for about 10 business days while the historic preservation crew works on that. And this is just one of many maintenance projects that we have to ensure the preservation of the lighthouse for future generations. In fact, all of these projects that are to preserve these assets within the park are fully funded by entrance fee dollars. So visitors entering and paying the park are actually investing in the protection of these things like the Old Point Loma Lighthouse. And the specific work that's being done this time, it's focusing on the walls surrounding the iconic spiral staircase. Essentially, they're repairing a bunch of plaster. It's kind of crumbled because moisture has gotten trapped behind the paint and has eroded away the plaster. And then they're going to, so after they repair that, paint it over with vapor permeable paint. So that kind of allows the walls to breathe a little bit better, and they won't trap moisture as much.
I've heard about similar problems at quite a few lighthouses over the years, and obviously we know a lot more about proper paints and coatings to use. The people did the best they could when that was done, but we've learned a lot about that.
Absolutely. Something that is really interesting to me that the historic preservation crew is working on is that a lot of the wood graining on like the windowsills or the baseboard, that's all faux wood graining, and it was a technique that they used back in the 1800s in order to make wood look like a more expensive type, so a more expensive type of hardwood, as opposed to just the regular wood that they were using. And so the historic preservation crew has had to learn how to do this process that isn't really used in modern day, to do that faux wood graining. And it's quite time intensive, but it looks amazing.
Wow. Well, that is really interesting. I'm glad you brought that up. I hope I can get back there sometime and see all that. I love San Diego too, so I really do hope to get back out there. So back to the 1891 lighthouse. I know a lot of people call it New Point Loma Lighthouse. I'll call it the Point Loma Light Station, the 1891 lighthouse. is actually still owned and managed by the Coast Guard. It's still an active aid to navigation. Kim and Karen, you said that you have been somewhat involved in doing some volunteer work there. But officially, is there any organization, like a friends organization or anything like that, working for that lighthouse?
No, not at all. The Coast Guard keeps that pretty tight. There was a $2.5 million restoration of that lighthouse 2 years ago that began in 2018 to 2019. It just about redid the whole lighthouse. Looks really nice.
I hate to tell you, that's 5 years ago now.
Oh my God. Oh boy.
Yeah. I keep forgetting we're in 2024. I keep writing 2023
Oh,
myself.
that's insane. I'm embarrassed.
No. That's okay. Never know what year it is. I was going to ask you, is there still Coast Guard living at the station there?
Yes, there is. The three keepers' quarters that are there are occupied by hierarchy of the Coast Guard.
There are 3 families that live there, and one of them is the captain, and then 2 higher ranking officers as well, or 2 higher ranking officials. I don't know their ranks per se. At one point, there were 3 families living there, and they all had about 3 kids in each family too, and it just seemed so idyllic of a childhood, and it kind of reminded me of my own, just how much you depend on your families in such like an isolated location.
Interesting place to grow up. Yeah. So is that lighthouse ever open to the public?
It is not.
No.
No, it's behind a gate. It's not very accessible at all. And yeah, since it is military property, they keep it under pretty strict lock and key.
As I remember from being there, I think the best photographic views are from up on high ground looking down towards it. Is that right?
It's one of them.
Yeah. Or if you can find someone to take you out on a boat. But yeah, specifically, if you're in the park and you're looking for a great bird's eye view of that light station, if you head over to the whale and kelp forest overlook, you can look down and see the beautiful green manicured lawns and the light tower and the palm trees. It's very beautiful.
It is, yeah. Kim and Karen, before we close things down here, I just want to talk a little bit about your book. Your book, Lighthouses of San Diego, right? What made you decide to write that book?
Well, first of all, we're mighty curious. And Kim and I looked for family members who served at our lighthouses. And we found and worked with 8 adult children of former keepers. And we had to get those pictures out and some of the history that we heard verbatim from the horse's mouth, people that lived there. Especially, there were a lot of good stories from World War II that would have been lost without these interviews that we had done. For example, little Pat Dudley, about 7 years old, stood on the point. It was right after Pearl Harbor was bombed. And little Pat Dudley stood out on the point, counting warplanes flying low overhead. She got to the count of 1,000, she said, and didn't know how to count beyond that. And she's embarrassed to tell us that she didn't think to start over with 1,000. But these were airplanes leaving factories here in San Diego, going out to sea to meet aircraft carriers.
Wow.
So just any number of really great stories, and they are all in our book, or most of them are in our book.
Yeah. You also, besides the 2 Point Loma lights, you also wrote about the old Ballast Point station, which we mentioned briefly earlier. I know there's the lighthouse is gone now. I believe a lantern from that lighthouse is actually sitting on a sidewalk basically in San Diego. Is that right?
Yes, and that lantern is still there with nothing in it, but the lantern is there, and the keeper of that store won't sell it. But our book, we talk about 6 different lighthouses, oddly. Of course, the 3 out here on Point Loma, Ballast Point, and the 2 Point Loma light stations. But in the 1915-16 Panama Exposition in Balboa Park, there was a tall lighthouse, a real lighthouse there, and the keepers from Ballast Point went to light that every day, so the story goes. And when that fair ended, they dismantled that and took it to the Panama Canal, and there are 3 others similar to it of varying heights. Now that's the story we get, and we've tried to confirm those stories. But also then there's the Harbor Light at Tom Ham's Lighthouse Restaurant, which is a Coast Guard kept beacon. And also we included in our book the lighthouse at Tijuana, because the Coast Guard lines up with that lighthouse when it comes into San Diego. So we included a short, a speck of pictures there in this book. so that we'd have some good history of our lighthouses here.
Absolutely. Karen and Kim, I know you've been to a number of countries to see lighthouses. Is it both of you who've traveled around to Scotland and other places, or is it mostly Kim? Or
Karen has been to a few of the light. We used to go to the East Coast in the fall for a couple of weeks and look at lights. She did that. But mostly Karen wants to be in her own bed at night, so it really kind of precludes looking at lighthouses elsewhere. Plus, she won't fly over the ocean.
yeah.
So,
Okay.
but yeah, the Scottish lights for their history and the French for their beauty and inside and out. So it's hard to pick one country, but I love Scotland, and the French lights are just unbelievable.
Yeah. I was lucky enough to get to Scotland with the U.S. Lighthouse Society tour, but I'd only saw mostly the Edinburgh area. And there's some beautiful ones around there. And then we went down the east coast of England. And then I got to go to Ireland last year. But the lighthouses in England, Scotland, Ireland are really, really beautiful and pretty much well taken care of for the most part. France, I've seen a lot of pictures of the French lighthouses, but I haven't got to see them in person so far. Some of them look like palaces. The interiors look pretty amazing too. That goes for a lot of the lighthouses over there. We're getting near the end here. I have a final question for the three of you. I'll ask it separately. And this is for bonus points, okay? All right. So first, let me direct this to Amanda. Amanda, what is your favorite thing or things about working at the Cabrillo National Monument and the Old Point Loma Lighthouse?
I would say my favorite things are the tide pools. I love exploring down there. It's never the same twice. There's always new things to discover. And then the views are amazing. I can't get past the views. That's why I've stuck around for 15 years, I think. And then in terms of the Old Point Loma Light, I just love how cozy it feels, and you can go in and you can get a sense of what life was like back then, and just being able to share that with the public, especially little kids who they live in such a connected world right now, and then to have them just take themselves out of that for a moment in time and reflect on what kids were going through 150 years ago. I think it's really special. There's not a lot of places that you can really do that in the world.
Beautifully said. Okay, and Kim and Karen, what has been your favorite thing over these years about volunteering at the Old Point Loma Lighthouse?
Oh boy, I love informing the park visitors about our history. And I love roaming the park or moving about the assistant keeper's quarters, showing off our lighthouse lens and telling remarkable stories of our bay, about the military out here on Point Loma, and of course the lighthouses. And certainly I love working with Kim and the Lantern. We have a good time goofing around up there, but we get our work done. Golly, our rangers trust us to do the job. We love that. And I wish you could see how adorable Amanda is.
Kim? And I could say the community service aspect, but it's actually quite selfish. I love being in the Lantern. I love the lenses. I love that I can put my paws on it and look after it, and watching the dust come away and the lens go shiny. I don't know. It's just being up there is just really, really fun. It means something to me. There is a book that Henry David Thoreau wrote about, and it's titled Cape Cod. You probably know it, Jeremy.
Oh yeah.
But I love something toward the end of the book that he talked about when he was at the Highland Lighthouse in Massachusetts, that he could stand there with all America at his back. And it never occurred to me until I visited there. When we got back, and the first time I was cleaning up there, I said, "Wait a minute, except for Hawaii and Alaska, I've got all of America at my back." And somehow or other, that I don't know, I love that. So I just love being up here.
I understand, and I know that quote well. Yeah, Thoreau spent some nights at the Lighthouse, Highland Lighthouse, as the guest of the keeper, and he wrote some beautiful things about it. And that is a great quote. I love it. And beautifully said by all of you, and I understand the love you have for that place. It is a very special place. I hope I can get back out there one of these years, maybe meet you all in person. But Kim and Karen and Amanda, I really appreciate you spending this time with me today. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We loved it. Thanks, Jeremy.
It's fun chatting with you, Jeremy.
To learn more about Old Point Loma Lighthouse and the Cabrillo National Monument, go online to nps.gov/CABR. There's lots of information on the history of the lighthouse and what to see when you visit there.
One of the interesting things about Old Point Loma is that the style of the building is sometimes referred to as a Cape Cod-style lighthouse. Basically, a Cape Cod-style lighthouse has a 1.5 or 2-story dwelling with the lighthouse tower rising up through the center of the roof. A bunch of them were built on Cape Cod in the 1800s, but none of those survive. So it's interesting that no Cape Cod-style lighthouses survive on Cape Cod. That's unless you count the Old Bass River Lighthouse in West Dennis on Cape Cod. It's now a hotel, and it's been added on to so much that the original lighthouse is barely recognizable.
The only surviving Cape Cod-style lighthouses in their original configuration are on the West Coast. Besides Old Point Loma, there are Point Pinos and Battery Point in California and Yaquina Bay in Oregon.
So, Jen, before we sign off, is there anything else you'd like to tell our listeners about Point Cabrillo? Anything coming up? Any news or upcoming events?
Well, we just put out our calendar for lens tours for the year, so we're going to be doing tours to the top of the lighthouse on the first weekend of every month, March through October. So we're really excited to get folks back up inside the lighthouse and standing out on that beautiful balcony.
When I was there, I didn't get to go up there, so I would love to go back and get to see the lens up close and the view from there. There's a website, right? How can people find out more about that?
Absolutely. It's pointcabrillo.org. That'll have all the information on events coming up and hours and whatever else we're working on out at the light station.
Yeah, that's not too complicated. pointcabrillo.org. So, Jen, do you have a quote about lighthouses?
I do. The author Ash K. Vasu once wrote, "Sometimes amidst of all of the wars, all you need to become is the lighthouse, not the sword."
That sounds good to me. Thanks so much for hosting today, Jen. It's really, really good to have you back on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Happy to be here.
Yeah, we'll have to do it again. So next week we'll be talking about Mukilteo Lighthouse. That's one of my favorite ones to say, Mukilteo. Mukilteo Lighthouse in the state of Washington. Until then, to all our regular listeners and our new ones, thank you so much for listening, and
keep a good light.
This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.